Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Unit 6 for our AP Literature Fiction. We are motoring right through. I'm seeing a couple of familiar names in the chat, so thanks for jumping on there, and welcome back. Thanks for jumping back and returning to us. Great to have y'all in here to join us. Let's get right into it. Like I said, we are right into Unit 6, and so we are really motoring through this cram season. And again, thank you to all of those people who have been joining us both live and in the recorded sessions. Thanks for taking a look here. You'll notice that tonight we'll open up with another "Would you rather" question. It is here on the East Coast. It is 8 o'clock. So thank you to those of you who are as your weekend is getting going. I know in my area, a lot of people had the day off today. So if that's you, even better. Good job jumping on. And thanks for taking this time as we're taking a look at this "Would you rather" question. Would you rather run 100 miles per hour or fly at 10 miles per hour? One of the things that I'm interested, even as I was putting this question together, presumably if you were running at 100 miles per hour, like, you'd still be running. There's an action that goes with that, right? And there's probably some exhaustion. You get winded or what have you. Do you get winded if you're flying? Like does Superman get winded? I don't know. But I suspect that flying at 10 miles per hour, if you do get winded, then I'm sure that takes a little bit out of you. So would you rather run at 100 miles per hour or fly at 10 miles per hour? I'm going to leave that up for a moment because we are tied at 2 there. While I leave that up, let's remember, of course, we'd love to have you joining us in the stream, in our chat, asking questions throughout the stream tonight. Gayatri's in there, and welcome to her. She's there, as always, very thankful to have her helping us out. So ask any questions that you can in there. We'll take a look. There are also a Q&A open, so feel free to let that populate. If you have any questions, if you see some questions that you want answered, make sure to just kind of give some feedback in there. But of course, definitely be working through that chat function. But obviously, if you are chatting with us tonight, your name may jump up there. So just be aware of that as you take a look at any of our recordings or space where we put this later on. As always, we want you to join us on the Twitters, the Insta, YouTube at Think5able. We want to make sure that you're joining us in there as well. So take advantage of all the spaces that we have that I know you definitely do take advantage of, and we appreciate you joining us there. We also appreciate you joining us on these crams. So a couple coming up. I've mentioned, and I'll mention again probably, maybe too frequently. We're going to be starting to put some stuff together. We've looked at, between short and long fiction. Again, we've tried to mix it up a little bit so that we're looking at specific things with regard to that fiction and what it is that we're talking about. But at the end of the day, a lot of the skills that the AP is going to be checking in on with you, and a lot of the things that they're going to be asking you for, is really, to see what you are pulling from the text with regard to character, plot, setting, symbol, those things. So we're trying to start to piece those together in a couple of different ways and seeing, are we recognizing them, but also now are we recognizing what they do and what they do in various texts. So as we're getting a look at that, we're going to take a look at some fiction and strategies next Wednesday. On the 11th, we'll be taking a look at some more poetry, and then getting into some FRQs. We've got fiction and drama listed there, but really starting to get into those FRQs and what is it that we can do to use the information that we're pulling out of that fiction and drama to help us to better read and write from those excerpts. It's a little bit what we're going to be doing tonight as well, but we do want to spend some time looking at some multiple choice tonight. That's going to be a bit of a defining feature for our work. I know maybe we've incorporated some really deliberate AP test prep practice in the past couple of weeks, but tonight in particular, we're going to be looking at some multiple choice questions, examples of what it is that you could take a look at. And so we'll pull those up, and this might take on a little bit of a different feel for those of you, again, who have been joining us with past streams. We're going to be doing things just a little bit differently, and they're going to have a little bit of a different look tonight. But the idea is that we're talking about reading fiction, and reading fiction effectively and efficiently. So how you move through the test in a quick way, but in an efficient way, meaning that you're doing something productive, you're just doing it quickly. And trying to get a sense of, there are any number of test-taking strategies that you've been given over the course of your school career. All of those come into play here. All of those are good and helpful. I'm going to show you how I like to go through and how I like to coach my students to go through the exam, as well as to also just take some time, because we've got a few minutes to sit together and talk through the pieces. Again, as I always say, the more that we're looking at multiple various pieces of literature, the better we are at practicing, different ways of reading and different ways of recognizing the skills that the AP is looking for. So we're going to take a look at reading efficiently. We're going to take a look at that multiple choice. And then we're going to talk about how to, really focus in on the test and the text that's in front of us. So we are taking a look a little bit more more deliberately on multiple choice questions tonight, while also talking about other spaces of the text. I've gone through this in the past. This is the way that I always like to talk about how we think about our work. If I'm saying that we're talking about level 1 language, I'm talking about just things that we see, the basic plot structure, the basic characters, what's going on, what it is that we can take away from them. Level 2 is where we want to live throughout the text. What do you think about what it is that you're reading? And then when you get into, it's when you get into the writing that you want to think about level 3, drawing conclusions, wondering what else you can take from a text. What level 3 looks like in multiple choice work is going back and saying, okay, I see something, I recognize what it is that my baseline of knowledge is for this question and for this excerpt. How do I then bring that into the question? I know how to read, I know how to analyze, but what specifically then is the question asking me to analyze? Because you need both. That's going to be the important thing. Again, another way to think about that is just, here's what I see, thinking about so what, and then now what else do I have to focus on? Again, examples of that include various plot, thematic things, and then ultimately opinions, or again, in this case, extending it to what under a microscope is the question asking me to focus on. These are the things we're going to talk about tonight. And as I read through, and as we read through the various excerpts that we have this evening, we want to make sure, first off, I apologize. I've been sitting here looking at this other bit, and I forgot to actually show us whether we'd rather run 100 miles or 10 miles per hour. And it was run. I apologize that I've been keeping you from this thesis area and this theme area. My apologies. As we take a look at this, though, this is what I'm thinking about over the course of the evening. When we read together, and as we read through the excerpts that I'm going to show you tonight, the thing that I want us to be thinking about are these pieces: plot, character, setting, and symbol. And we've talked a lot about particularly character and how the character is living within any of those spaces, how those things are symbolic, how those things are important to characterization, and how those things are important to what else is influencing the character, and so how then the author is talking to us through any of these spaces. As we read through tonight, I want to touch on each of these pieces briefly and generally, and then take a minute to think through a few things. One, what are some commonalities that we're noticing in these excerpts? Two, how are they all coming together, and how are they how are they making us feel in the moment? Because again, you're going to read and you're going to know something right from the jump. The thing that you want to be aware of as you're taking this test and as you're doing this reading is that unfortunately you are taking a test, and so you have to be a little bit more on. You're doing work. One of the things that can happen in a test like this is that God forbid you enjoy the literature, right? You end up resonating with the literature. You're going to resonate with it, and that's great. Your job is to focus in on some of the more granular pieces of it. So we're going to take a look to think through, what is it that you're resonating with? What can we ultimately say? And what then are you being asked for? So let's take a look. The way that we're going to work tonight, again, I said this is going to be a little bit different. So we're going to be thinking through some multiple choice questions, but first we're going to actually have to read the excerpt, right? So that's going to take us a second. In the past, I've given you some excerpts right here in the slide, and it's been pretty easily contained because it's right in the slide. We can skim through it pretty quickly. Tonight, we're going to be looking at those actual excerpts pulled from the from AP Prep Work, the AP Classroom, and so that's going to take a second. Now, and I timed these out a little while ago. Most of these are going to take a second. If you are just purely skimming, looking at them very quickly, it takes about a minute and a half to 2.5 minutes to read each of these sections. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to do a few things as well. Skim with purpose. Remember, we talked about wanting to work efficiently. Efficiently means quick, but purposefully. This is how you do it. And I know I've said this before, but those of you who maybe are just joining us for the first time, or those of you who are taking advantage of all of our crams, you might have this go by the wayside. Now, I like to think about, because these are the 5 S's of skimming, but I like to think about them as high pi to remember the second letter. What shifts do you notice in speaker, point of view, in what's happening in the text? We're actually going to notice some of the questions are specifically asking tonight about how the setting or the mood shifts. So what shifts do you notice? Do you notice any interesting syntax? Do you notice any interesting sentence structure, including punctuation? What's being emphasized by that shift? Does the speaker change, or just in general, what do we know about the speaker? How is the speaker being created, and what's important about that perspective? What's the situation, which is just to say, what's the plot? What's going on? And if there's multiple things going on, how do they relate? And then really to start first and last. What's the first sentence in a section? What's the last sentence in a section? And then doing active skimming. The skimming that you may have done all the time if you forget to read something until too late at night and you go back and you just look through the chapter so you're ready for the day, that kind of thing. Do you notice the first sentence, the last sentence? Quick, can you look and figure out how we got there? So we're going to give you a little bit of time to do both tonight. I'll give you a moment. I'll give you a couple of links and spaces where you can pull up the text. Again, it's going to take maybe 2.5 minutes to take a look here. I'll give you a moment to skim it quickly for about 15 to 30 seconds, but I'm also going to talk over the text a little bit as I'm skimming it. So if you want to maybe just turn down your volume just a little bit, know that you want to come back so that we can talk about it and we can hear each other talking about it. And obviously, if I move on a slide, that means we're moving on. But I will take a moment if you want to just kind of drop down, because I will be talking over these excerpts as we go along. The first excerpt tonight, and again, as always, feel free as we're doing this. I see a couple of questions. I'm never super, always anything that you want to Google to look at AP Lit terms. I think Quizlet's great, and I'm always going to pump up those spaces. There's a lot of work that's already been done for you, and to have those terms available to you is great. Every time I go looking for, every time you just Google AP Lit terms, you'll find a list of terms that's different than the one that you found before. And so do make sure that you're taking a look at that. My biggest tip to you when you're thinking about studying is write the flashcard yourself, because that's something that is actively you thinking on that work. It's a product of studying while you're going through it. So look at what you can Google, what your teacher has given you. I, for one, have 3 or 4 different AP Lit term docs that are just sitting on my desktop whenever I want to pull from something and say, okay, what can I talk about in class today? And just pull from that a little bit. What are something that I forgot to talk about? Let's pull from that. What can I talk about in this section? Let's pull from that. But if you're trying to study and have those things available to you, think about those. Think about doing that work. Just to keep that as a study tool for yourself as well. Thank you for that question. Thank you for using that space. Let's take a moment to think through. So we're looking here at After Dark by Wilkie Collins. While I was answering that question in the Q&A, hopefully you took a look, you pulled up this reading however you can. Obviously, there's a QR code. If you just pull open your camera function on a phone and hold it up, a tab should drop down for you, or you can copy and paste or type in that tiny URL there at the bottom here. Thinking about After Dark by Wilkie Collins. So as I pull that up, again, just skimming with that HiPy, taking a look at a few sentences first. I see a couple of, I love the, Google characters that pop up. The anonymous Ifrit is what I see right now. So thanks for jumping in there with us. Take a look. Again, the first thing that I would recommend you do is with every paragraph, first and last sentence, and then how do we get there? Take a moment to just think through that. So as I'm taking a look at this briefly myself and looking through this quickly, if I'm skimming this, the first thing I see is that first sentence, and I notice that very first sentence is itself a full sentence, or that those first 3 lines are themselves a single sentence with a semicolon in the middle. See, a timely recommendation from one of my kindest friends and patrons placed the commission for painting the likeness of my in my lucky hands, and I was instructed to attend on a certain day Mr. Boxius' private residence. Thanks for jumping that in there, Tiana. Fantastic. And welcome back today. Good to see you. With all my materials ready for taking a first sitting. Taking a look at the bottom, so noticing that that's a sentence unto itself, taking a look at the last sentence of the excerpt, we see similarly just 3 lines. He chuckled as he said this and walked away to the window. It was quite useless to take anything he said seriously, so I finished preparing my palette for the morning's work in the utmost serenity of look and manner that I could possibly assume. Now, looking at those quickly, a couple of the things that I'm thinking, and again, as you're skimming through the rest of this, you'll sort of notice some of the shifts here. I see a timely recommendation for my kindest friends and patrons. Strikes me that these are characters, again, if we're thinking about plot, character, setting, and some symbolism, first I'm going to think about character because I want to think about motivation. So I see we've got some characters who are seemingly friendly, know one another. They patron. This is someone who is patroning a specific business, and a commission to painting a likeness. We're talking about someone who is an artist who is being paid to create this work. And I see kindest friends. So if I'm thinking about motivation, that jumps out to me immediately. As I skim down to the bottom here, though, looking at that last sentence and then curious how we got there, the tenor of the actual sentence seems appropriate, but a little off. He chuckled as he said this. Okay, kindest patron, kindest friend. Chuckling makes sense. That seems to track so far. It was quite useless to take anything he said seriously. That tracks. Maybe they're lighthearted. Maybe they're friendly. So I finished preparing my palette for the morning's work with the utmost serenity of look and manner that I could possibly assume. That last bit, putting on, it seems like the narrator is putting on a little bit of a face. It does seem a little maybe insincere. That word assume kind of shifts with me a little bit, and I wonder. It seems I can't quite recognize if that's somebody who is, being serious, being severe, is in on the joke. I wonder about that as well. And so as you're skimming through here, and as we've been reading, it's been about 3 minutes, and so perhaps you're near the end. One of the lines that stands out to me right in the middle is this piece of dialogue that's alone by itself on a single line. "I should be ready directly, sir," said I. "Ready directly," repeated my new sitter. "What do you mean, Mr. Artist, by ready directly? I'm ready now." Seems a little hostile. Seems a little bit, kind of confrontational. And it's kind of difficult to recognize. And again, as you're reading through this, it might be difficult to recognize exactly just how much their relationship seems friendly. To a degree, it does not. There might be a tone of sarcasm. There might be a bit of confrontation or abruptness or bluntness, and it might seem a little out of place. So we ask ourselves, so we've got this character, we've got these questionable motives between the two of them, this questionable relationship between the two of them. They're in an art studio. As far as what's going on in terms of the plot, we read through, and we have two characters who are meant to be sitting together, and one of them seems a little bit more hurried than the other in something that should maybe be, even though it's a job, should maybe be a little bit more casual. We get this as we read, and we're obviously going to want to take as much time to read a second time if we can on the test. But one of the things that we want to think about is, now that we've read through, got that first reading under our belt, got the wholeness of this piece of work together, and so we get a sense again of what in the text is resonating with us. And feel free, as you're going through and we're looking at a couple of these questions, though, throw in the chat, what are some pieces of this that are resonating with you? What about the motivations and the characters and their interactions is resonating with you? What's standing out to you? Take a minute to think on that. And then take a moment as we go back in here. Obviously, you have this. I'll leave these links up as we shift on. I'll leave these links in the QR code, and obviously the link is in the chat for us. And thank you again. But let's take a moment to look at the first question. How do the events and actions presented in the first two paragraphs, okay, so we talked about at least that first sentence, now that larger paragraph, serve to heighten the subsequent impression made by Boxes on the reader? Now, let me mention here in this question, let's take a look at it before we even take a look at the options. A few things. I'm going to open a poll here in just a moment so that we can access this. I'll tell you something, a little bit of spoilers tonight. None of the answers are E. I've only included A, B, C, D in all of these. None of the answers are E. But I've included E in here regardless, because I do want to take a moment to look at it and say, okay, here's why it isn't that. And hopefully we recognize, we want to, as much as possible, if we're going to be doing the practice, we want to be doing it realistically, to be thinking about that fifth option and noting that there are 5 options. Because that can make our, just our process of elimination and that test taking skill a little bit more, just a little bit more, again, realistic. So let's take a look at the question itself. Before I open the poll, I notice that in the beginning of this question, how do the events and actions? That's an interesting way to put that, to pose that question, because events are things that happen. Actions are things that happen. So the things that the fact that we have to mention both of them maybe indicates that there's some motion and some interaction that's occurring that we also want to focus on, not just the actual plot. And so you want to be thinking back on character by virtue of the way that the question is asked in the first place. So I would say the first thing you want to do here is to go back, and as I open the poll, take a moment to say, what is it that the question's asking? Go back and read those 2 paragraphs again, with now the questions in mind. So again, I'll drop this down just for a moment so that you can see our options. They encourage the reader, A, B, C, and D. They encourage the reader to mistrust the narrator's cheery optimism. They persuade the reader to share the narrator's growing confidence. They guide the reader to anticipate a dramatic change in the narrator's life. They establish a false expectation for the reader of an unremarkable session. They prepare the reader to prefer boxes over the long-winded narrator. So we'll take a moment. If there's anything in the actual question that confuses you, feel free to put it in the Q&A, or feel free to just mention it in the chat to help each other out. Per usual, much appreciated. But as you think through, and again, that's another strategy that I'm certain a teacher along the way has mentioned to you, read the question and then go back and look at the actual work. My recommendation to my students is to read the passage first, get that, resonate with it in some way, understand it in its entirety, and then go and look at the questions and try to go back and read through, assuming that you can do that again efficiently. While we're waiting for people, and I'll just show this up here. While we're waiting for people to take a look, I'm looking at, they prepare the reader to prefer boxes over the long-winded narrator. That's E, and I've told you from the jump that that's wrong. It's important to recognize that that one does feel a little bit like a red herring. They prepare the reader to prefer boxes over the long-winded narrator. Now, maybe we do. Maybe it seems like he's supposed to be friendly. He's introduced as being friendly. And so maybe we are meant to be prepared for that. But take a look at some of the others. And I'm just going to talk about them each individually for a moment here. They encourage the reader to mistrust the narrator's cheery optimism. I don't know that we're encouraged to feel that way, but maybe we do recognize some cheeriness. They persuade the reader to share the narrator's growing confidence. Perhaps there is some growing confidence. Perhaps the tenor of the actual reading swells a little bit. But I don't think that's it as well. And I'm seeing a handful of people going right now between C and D. And again, continue to jump in there. We'll talk about them for a minute. They guide the reader to anticipate a dramatic change in the narrator's life. For a minute there, I do have they guide the reader to anticipate. I think that there's a lot of that there. But anticipating a dramatic change, perhaps not. They establish a false sense of expectation for the reader for an unremarkable session. For what it's worth, that is in fact the AP's suggested answer there. And as we take a look back at it, let's go back into those questions for a moment. It's a timely recommendation from one of my kindest friends and patrons. So again, there's that language, friends and patrons. And as we move into that longer paragraph, that larger paragraph, we're looking and we see this narration, this description of a pretty, neighborhoodly feel. Maybe a little bit more in terms of this meadow, but there's places around it, which is to say that people are maybe a little bit more friendly. Small door, a banker's office, a plain lamp, a big door plate, a few shops are around. I was still looking out at the view thus presented when suddenly the apostrophized by a glib, disputatious voice behind me. The disputatious, weird word. Disputing. Someone is being a little bit confrontational. And so when we take a look at the question, and I'll put that away for a moment, when we take a look at the question and we take a look at option D, they establish this false expectation. Things seem a lot more convivial and a lot more friendly than they end up actually being. Not to say that anything too contentious happens, but it does feel as though it was going to be a bit friendlier. Let's think about another question from this, and I'll take a look at this one. Which choice best describes the interactions between the two characters from the beginning of the third paragraph? Okay, so now we're starting with the rest of that through the end of the passage. And we'll take a moment to take a look at that as you think through the rest of that. Now, it might be too much to say, let's go back and read the whole excerpt again, eliminating the first two paragraphs. So we don't necessarily want to think through there, but we can take a look at a couple of spaces throughout, and I've already mentioned one of them. I shall be ready directly. Ready directly, repeated my new sitter. What do you mean, Mr. Artist, by ready directly? I'm ready now. What was your contract with the town council, who have subscribed for this pleasure to paint the portrait? And what was my contract? To sit for it. Here I am. I'm ready. And so it is hostile, even if maybe perhaps a bit tongue-in-cheek. So we see there's a list of complaints leads to proposals of remedies. There are a list of complaints, and maybe there's something to be said for a cause and effect relationship that's mentioned, but a list of remedies, not so much. A confrontation is initiated, but does not become a conflict. A disagreement is expressed articulately and finally resolved. I think that again, that listing occurs, but the actual resolution of it is just that's the awkwardness that they're going to live in for the rest of the passage. A series of accusations are consistently met with anger and defiance, and a challenge is issued but does not result in a competition. I think that last one is a tricky one. It does feel like a challenge is issued but does not result in a competition. There's conflict that occurs, but it doesn't actually amount to much, is true. This one, again, feels like something that's a little bit more of an action rather than something that's actually delivered upon. So there isn't as much actual action. But again, let's take a look here. The actual answer A does sort of fall in line with what D kind of isn't saying. That there is a confrontation that's initiated, but it doesn't actually become a conflict, which is to say conflict in a more with more action. That is the conflict in that it's the driver of the plot, but it's not necessarily a conflict in that it becomes a problem for anybody. Taking a look at the question about glib is that it's a bit offhand. It's a bit, it is a bit tongue-in-cheek. It's knowing, it's smarmy and sarcastic. It's maybe even a little condescending. But again, there's a character, when we talk about the word glib, there's a character who is sort of pulling rank and trying to position themselves as the person who's leading the conversation, not the person who's necessarily following the conversation. And that's definitely an important word to think on and to have at your disposal as you're thinking about how these characters are interacting. Let's take a look at another, the Awakening. I suspect this may be a text that perhaps, and obviously any of these texts could be one that that's been brought into your class in particular. One of the things I want to emphasize, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later on, one of the things that I want to emphasize for you is to remember that even if you're reading your favorite book and it comes up on the exam, do not worry about it. Just because you know a lot about the text does not mean that you're doesn't mean that you can bring a lot to it. You have to focus in on exactly what is in front of you. You should have some confidence in that. You should know that the excerpt that's in front of you is probably something that you've got some experience with, and you're going to really drive it out of the park. That's going to be great. But you also want to be really active in that. Don't take your foot off the gas. Take a moment to say, yeah, I have this question. I have this excerpt in front of me. I definitely know what it is that I can say about this excerpt, but you want to be careful not to bring more to it than is actually in front of you. That's more true on the question 2 FRQ than it is on a multiple choice question, because again, multiple choice is just going to ask you for what it's going to ask you for. You've got to focus in on what it's asking. But when it comes to an FRQ, you want to be sure to just focus in on the specific excerpt that's being given to you. So if you've read The Awakening by Kate Chopin, you want to make sure that you're focusing still on just this excerpt today. And you still want to remind yourself of what's being asked. Make sure that you don't say, oh, I can just skip to the questions and go back to it. You want to focus on what the parameters are that the test is giving you. What excerpt have they chosen? Where does it start and where does it end? So let's take a look. I appreciate we got ourselves an anonymous dragon and an anonymous panda in our Google Doc here. So that's fantastic. And I'll give you just a moment to skim through that a little bit. We notice as we take a look here, especially if we're thinking about these sentences, the first and last, as we go through each, even if we just look at the first sentence of each paragraph, we notice a bit of repeating structure. He thought Mr. Pontellier had forgotten. Mr. Pontellier returned to his wife. Mrs. Pontellier was quite sure that Raoul, he reproached Mrs. Pontellier. A lot of subject first language right at the get-go. And so taking a look in here, it's a bit short, it's a bit choppy, and a lot of, if we're scanning for situation, we're noticing that the feeling of the excerpt is elevating pretty rapidly. The things that are happening in this excerpt and the mood of what's going on is getting more and more tense pretty abruptly from paragraph to paragraph. So taking a look there, we recognize that the situation is increasing in its intensity. We're bouncing back and forth Our narrator seems to be third person, and so we're seeing Mr. and Mrs. back and forth. We're also taking a look and recognizing how just a little bit more of those interactions in that plot are starting to play together. The setting, the setting is a house, and the events that are unfolding is something that seems fairly domestic, and so we can sort of say that and move on. We're not necessarily noticing anything in terms of symbol, but we are noticing that it's the interaction between these two characters that's pushing and advancing the plot along. So as we take a look at that and recognize that tone, let's take a moment to look at a few of these questions. The first being, the sequence of interactions between Mr. and Mrs. Pontillier helps establish the central focus of the passage, primarily by moving from what to what. Again, let's jump to, I'll pull this up on our poll briefly. I'll leave that sort of off to the side for a moment. You've got those answers in front of you. And we'll publish that in a minute. But taking a look briefly at E, a thoughtful conversation to speculation to anxious consultation. Very little of this starts off with thoughtful. So really right from the jump, we know that answer probably not it, because nothing about this is thoughtful. It's maybe mundane. It's maybe benign. It's not really thoughtful. The other pieces, that anxious consultation maybe comes up at the end, but not, but the rest of that, not so much. Quiet chatting, yeah, seems fair. To insults and vociferous defiance. Really sort of angry, impassioned defiance. I don't know that that's that anything defiant is happening here. Is there confrontation happening? Perhaps, but there's not necessarily defiance. Casual disagreement to conflict to hostile silence, maybe. Now quiet chatting and casual disagreement seem kind of in the ballpark with one another. Comfortable teasing to reproaches to shared humiliation. Now, I don't necessarily think that any of that is particularly true, but that shared humiliation piece is definitely where it loses me. There doesn't feel to be anything shared, especially as we look to in paragraph 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, he reproached his wife with her inattention, her habitual neglect of her children. If it wasn't a mother's place to look after her children, who on earth was it? That's nothing about that is shared. That's not something that we'd see as healthy, and it's certainly not something that is just comfortable teasing. And it's certainly not something that is shared humiliation. So I see a couple of people are jumping in here with B. Let's take a look. No, pardon me. A couple of people are jumping in here with B, and indeed it is, for all the reasons that we sort of pointed to, just a moment ago. It is casual. There is conflict. It's the last piece that's really important. That hostile silence, as we look towards, and even if we broke up the text into sort of three pieces there, that's exactly what's happening. By the end of it, especially in the penultimate paragraph, the second to last paragraph here, Mrs. Pontillier was by that time thoroughly awake. She began to cry a little and wiped her eyes on the sleeve of her peignoir, blowing out the candle which her husband had left burning. Even that line is really so poignant, just by virtue of the fact that he's rebuking her for neglect, and he's left this candle on, and there's something that he hasn't thought of and he hasn't been thoughtful of, which I think is important as well. With that in mind, let's take a look at the next question here. The actions described in that 8th paragraph build on the events presented earlier in earlier paragraphs. Primarily how? So let's take a look at that poll. Now, again, this is one that maybe you've chewed on this excerpt for one question, and so you already kind of have a sense of how the actual excerpt is progressing, because you had to go back, and you probably, for that question we just went over, probably had to look at it a couple of times, because you went from kind of beginning, middle, end, and broke up those paragraphs accordingly. So you've probably reread it. Now you've come to a second question on the test. You can maybe just jump around a little bit, because you do have a working knowledge of that excerpt for however many questions you have in front of you. Let's look at E first, again, remembering that it's going to be wrong. Confirming the determination of Mrs. Pontellier to punish her husband. Not quite there. She's certainly in a bit of a more reclusive state. Let's take a look at A through D. Clarifying the intentions about Mr. Pontellier's pronouncement about Raoul. Doesn't feel very clarified. It doesn't really feel like there's anything there that even feels warranted necessarily. Explaining the impact of the quarrel on the family as a whole. There is an impact that happens here and is elucidated by this 8th paragraph. So we can maybe put a check next to that as a maybe. Revealing the full context for Mr. Pontellier's accusation against his wife. Perhaps not. Suggesting the intensity of Mrs. Pontellier's feelings about the confrontation. So if we're looking at B and D, both seem possible. So if we're doing that sort of process of elimination work, maybe we cross out the rest of them and we just highlight B and D, and we see explaining the impact and suggesting the intensity. The first part of those two answers are kind of the same. But the fact that we're focusing in on Mrs. Pontellier is in fact what our correct answer points to. So great work there. Let's take a moment here. I want to point, I'm going to jump ahead here, just noticing our time. I want to jump into City Shoes, just because we've taken a look. Dusk is the excerpt, and again, you can see these slides in our Discord space, and so we can have those available to you. Taking a look at Dusk, a lot of the questions and interactions are similar there as they were with the Awakening. So I am going to jump ahead here to City Shoes in the Village, just because there we're looking a little bit more at character, setting, and how the setting is described, and how that setting plays a little bit more of an active role. So I want to focus in a little bit on that for y'all. So we'll take a look and focus in there. Apologies for blocking off that URL. Let's take a look here for a moment at City Shoes in the Village. So I said from the get-go here just a moment ago, there would be no familiar faces to greet him when he arrived. I said that we wanted to focus a little bit more on the setting. And here's some language that obviously discusses our character, but it's got more setting language included. Familiar faces is sort of again, that's more characters, but it's characters who are representing this space that we're in. They're unfamiliar, and he's arriving there. It means that he's unfamiliar as well. Take a look a bit, and I'm scanning again for interesting syntax. Remember that we want to take a look at some shifts that maybe we noticed. We noticed that in the last excerpt. Here I'm going to focus a little bit on syntax, because I notice right away, if I'm looking quickly, a lot of these paragraphs are fairly short. I'm also noticing the first line of the second paragraph the dub-dub rhythms of the engine. It's a little bit of an onomatopoeia. The dub-dub of an engine, as though it's sort of puttering along. And then as I'm scanning a little bit more, I see this English hab, which is italicized, and so there's and includes an exclamation point, and so I notice that there's some meaningful syntax here. Again, I'm seeing more and more single lines that are italicized, so that's standing out to me as well. And then as we get a little bit closer down, a little bit further down the page, we see even more now longer paragraphs, still with some moments that are italicized. And so and now obviously I have read through this, so I'm being a little disingenuous here, but even if I'm just looking at the shape of this work and the shape of this excerpt, I might notice that from the get-go, I'm seeing there would be no familiar faces to greet him when he arrived. Things are kind of short and choppy and dissonant, but as we get down, things are getting, some patterns are repeating in terms of the structure, and some patterns are repeating in terms of, or some patterns are changing in terms of the length. So maybe some of these questions or these conversations, rather, this dialogue is becoming a little bit more familiar because more is happening there. And I can get that sense from just even from looking at it, in addition to reading it, if I'm scanning for shifts in syntax. For what it's worth, if it's interesting to you, we've got an anonymous jackalope, an anonymous liger, and an anonymous kraken, probably our best little Google avatars of the evening. Phenomenal. If you take a look at this question, and I'll open up the poll here, taking a look, the tone created by the use of italics and hyphens. So obviously, knowingly, I've pointed that out as we're working along here. But I will take just another moment, and I'll wait to see some answers popping in, and let you just read through that a little bit. So again, as I'm trying to take a look here at the first sentences to give me a little bit of something to point to, and trying to find ways to anchor myself in the text and recognize some of the pieces that help me to get there. I notice this line: the children swiveled their necks to look. None of them were old enough to remember him. They questioned him and each other. Are you this one's brother? Is he that one's son? The other one's cousin? And so that's where I'm going to start to point out some of these places. The language also starts to get a little bit more familiar as well. And we can see even he speaks in Bangla. And so he's able to recognize he's one of us, our folk. So I see a couple of answers coming in here. So let's take a look at this question, this first question. The tone created by the use of italics and hyphens throughout the passage helps to express which of the following perspectives? The children's excitement at an unexpected arrival of a stranger, the children's curiosity, surely, at this and suspicion about a man they assume to be English. And that's surely true throughout this passage, that there's someone who seems, there's an unknown and an unknowing ambiguity here. The children's surprise in an attempt to imitate the sound of an unfamiliar motorboat. For what it's worth, that unfamiliar motorboat is the lungi, which is the maybe 5 paragraphs down, this first long paragraph. is that boat. It doesn't look exactly like the image that I put there, but it is kind of like that image, a little bit more ferry-like with a bigger belly. The older boy's sense of authority over a group of younger children. And then, obviously, the wrong answer, Altoff's realization of his growing inability to understand his native language. Now, while that's inaccurate, again, there's something unknown, but it does tip us a little bit to a relationship that that's revealed to us in the actual excerpt, but is still true here. That it's something that he should know, and it's something that should be known, but isn't. And in fact, that's what ultimately happens with regard to our question here, is that A is this answer. Well, the tone created by the italics is that there's this children's excitement. I actually think that it's specifically the combination of the italics and the hyphens that makes everything feel rapid and overly pronounced and fast. It is sort of a sound that's echoing the motor of this boat, but by the same token, a hyphen in that italics sort of makes us read it quickly in a way that seems high intensity and high energy, the way that a child would be excited. So let's take a moment to look at the next one, just sort of in the same vein. Which of the following best conveys Altoff's emotional relationship to his home village? I think this is a particularly important one to read a second time. Which of the following best conveys his emotional relationship, not just the relationship? Because I think if you were to just say relationship, that's sort of the trigger word here, is that all of these do convey an accurate portrayal of his relationship with this space and with this setting. The thing that's important is that we want to be focusing on the emotional one. And it's also important to recognize that there are some here that maybe reflect his emotional relationship, but do not actually convey an emotional relationship. So we want to know, if we wanted to say what is the emotion, one of these lines has to help us there. So take a look there. Our options here, while you're taking a look there. Again, this is something that we can answer probably. We have all of the citations of the paragraph numbers for us, so we have some good work there that we can take a look at. And we can go back into, but we probably have a good sense of what the relationship is, and we can get it just by rereading just this space in front of us for the questions. But Altoff could expect the children to hear his call. The word expect there in option A, probably not necessarily what it is that we, probably not exactly what it is that we recognize from the text. There's no expectation because everything seems really disjointed. They think you are an Englishman. Accurate. It seems that there's something that is not that's not associated, that's not known, but doesn't necessarily reflect an emotion. He would have been more comfortable traveling in a lungi. Now, important because there's some comfort, and maybe comfort is an emotional comfort. Does it show his home, though, is a question. This is Murupar village, isn't it? Is something that shows some ambiguity and shows some confusion. So maybe that's reflective as well. But let's take a look here, and I'll show you a moment here. It is actually, in fact, C. So I recognize that, again, like I said, all of these show relationship, but let's talk about C, especially since, I definitely don't want to end the evening on a low note without that accurate answer. I think a lot of people have been doing a really good job getting a lot of these answers tonight, so you should feel confident in that. But let's talk about that word comfort. There's an emotional comfort. Now, I suspect that nobody chose C for this reason. his comfort would have been in the boat, not in this place that he's from. But that's just it. No one seems to know him. At least the kids who are coming up to him don't seem to know him. And so the comfort is in his boat, which is a place where he does know the terrain a little bit better. It's some place where he is at home. But now he's arrived at this place that should be his home and should be a place of comfort for him, but isn't. And so think on that for a moment. I've added this in here. We'll get into solid. I'm going to hold on to our work here. Feel free to read through and scan this if you'd like for clock dance as our FRQ to talk about that we would have talked about tonight. But we are just about to the end of our time. So I will add this into our FRQ section that I pointed out for, I believe the 11th is when that FRQ time comes up. So we'll think on that a little bit. But what I do want to point out about this, just to recognize why I talked about it, was to talk about the instructions here. Analyze how Tyler uses literary elements and techniques to convey complex relationships among the characters. Tonight, we've talked about a few things. We've talked predominantly about complex relationships among our characters. And if you've been doing practice, which I suspect you have, and obviously we bring these questions in each week, the question always asks about complex relationships. We can ignore that piece. We don't want to ignore it. Truthfully, we want to make sure we name the complex relationship, but the relationship is not a complex one. We don't want to name it complex. We want to recognize what that complexity is. And in all three of the excerpts that we looked at tonight, all of them had different degrees of complexity, whether it be an unknown, whether it be an unfair confrontation, whether it be an unexpected confrontation. All of those things showed a different level of complexity. So that part's there. What you want to think about in terms of those techniques, though, is, again, how you scanned it. What are the odd instances of syntax? What are the odd shifts? And how can you use some language to name that? In general, let's think this way. Always read the excerpt first and get a sense of it in the first place. Then do the thing that you should, that I know you know how to do, which is to read the question first and then scan the excerpt with the question in mind. My recommendation against that is that there are too many questions for you to keep in your head as you're going through the excerpt. So master the excerpt first, or in as much space as you can, and as much time as you can, and then hyper focus on the space that the question is asking for. I think it was Kobe Bryant who said something to the effect of, "It's not how much you practice, it's how much you practice intentionally. Practice doesn't make perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect." You want to always be thinking about what it is that you're reading for. So read the passage first, then look at the question and try to go back to the space that the question is asking about. Some dates or context. So we looked at a little bit of language from 3 different time periods tonight. And when it's written might help, but the answers are in the excerpt, okay? So whatever language you're pulling from that is important that you're focusing on what's in front of you. Sometimes the dates will help, but they're never going to give you any more answer than you really need. So all that is to say, focus on the text. You do want to avoid any sort of modern commentary that you would bring to it, but you also want to avoid any of your own knowledge that you would bring to it. Try to focus exactly on what's being asked. And so focusing on the test and focusing on the questions that you're being asked is really, really important, and focusing on what it is that is even nuanced in the question can be really important as well. Definitely, again, as always, keep in touch with us as well as you did tonight. Thank you so much for the work that you put into the chat, the work that you put into our Q&A, and the work that you put into our polls. Definitely bring that same energy to all of our social. And of course, keep that conversation going on our Discord channel. ask any questions there. Again, anything that maybe we're missing for you. Again, even just bringing in a lot of some deliberately multiple choice work tonight came from a lot of recommendations on the Discord. So definitely make sure to give us a shout out there, and anything that you're particularly interested in. Bring that into that space so we can bring it back to you. Thank you all. I hope you have a good weekend. If you were off today, I hope you have a good long weekend. Get some rest, and we'll hopefully see you again next Wednesday. Have a good weekend, y'all.